Okay, so we've been talking about tools for interpretation and the genre tool. How do different forms impact the way that we are to read? And I asserted a few things this last class period, that there are established forms of communication. We have these even in our own culture. And there are different expectations that you have when you compose in different forms. So let's just take three or four ways to compose a text. Okay, let me just write them down. Let's think of the most formal way that you know to write a text. So there is official letterhead. So something that's on official letterhead. And then let's say a handwritten letter that's mailed. And let's take an email. And then let's take a text. Let's do one more. I was going to say Facebook Message, but what's a message app you use? Is there a message option on like Instagram or Snap? What would just let me say Facebook Messenger and just call me old. Okay, so these are different forms, right? Has anybody ever written something on official letterhead? Well, maybe not, because just the stage of your life. But there's a lot of documentation that I have to produce that goes out on official letterhead. So, we type it up. It's very nice paper. So even the quality of paper is different. But when it comes with the seal of either Cedarville University, or if I'm in my local church with the seal of that church, it communicates something, right? If you get a letter from the president's office, sometimes it'll have a golden seal on it. And it's like, there are different expectations that I have for a letter that comes with a golden seal on really nice paper, right? So official letterhead communicates a certain form or authority. A handwritten letter, I know a lot of people don't do this, but I think I argued in one of our lectures that that's a lost art that you really should think about. A handwritten letter has a certain personal tone to it, right? You don't write handwritten stuff for official documents anymore. You understand that? Like, your handwriting, that's one of the reasons that handwriting is so deplorable today, is because the only time you write is for your own reading, right? Anything you turn into me, it's not handwritten. Anything that you communicate with somebody in an official capacity, it's not handwritten. So really, you can have your own handwriting. You can have your own little language if you want, as long as you can communicate with yourself in that for reference. But handwritten letter to someone else is a personal interaction. You don't get a handwritten letter from your doctor. You don't get a handwritten letter from your school or your employer. You get a handwritten letter from friends or family or pastors, right? Or an email. Now, an email is very versatile because it can be official or it can be impersonal. A text message. Now, text message, it's kind of changing. It used to be much more informal, but now there's some more formal things that can happen through text message. And one of the least formal ways is a Facebook message, right? Like Cedarville University did not communicate with you your scholarship package through Facebook Messenger, right? You would say that's inappropriate. Even though it's easily documented, it's just, I have expectations when I get a Facebook message of more informal interactions. Does that make sense? How these different forms of communication, even written text, come with certain expectations. So that as an author, if I'm going to communicate something with an addressee, I'm thinking, I need to make the tone and the content of my message match the medium with which I communicate. And you have expectations for how that happens. That's what genre is. It's a form that an author chooses through which to communicate a message. Now, we looked at discourse or letter or epistle. Now we're going to look at narrative. And in some ways, this is intuitive to us because we know stories. Story is a natural way to communicate. But in some ways, we need to think about, we need to train ourselves to be better readers because some of the story conventions are different today than they were back then. And we're not always great readers of stories. Have you ever read a story with a young kid? Maybe a younger sibling or a cousin, and you're reading along and you ask them a couple questions and you realize they're actually not following the main point of the story. Has anybody ever had that experience where you're reading and you're like, no, that's not what that is about? Or they start seeing, like, one of my kids is more imaginative than the other two, and she starts seeing meaning in all sorts of things. Like, no, that was an incidental point. Put that aside and focus on the main message. And sometimes we're like that with stories in the Bible. We can miss the main message because we're not as keen of readers as we should be. We are actually much more comfortable probably now with a 2-hour movie and following that storyline than we are comfortable following the storyline of a well-crafted narrative. It's a challenge for us. Let me ask this question. When you think about a movie, like I'm going to go see a movie, who likes a simple plot that doesn't surprise them? It's just like an exciting or funny movie and merely entertaining. Or who likes, I want a rich story to be developed. I want there to be twists and turns. I want to be engaged in the development of the story. Is there anybody that likes just the simple, comedic or action-packed movie? Oh, I'm totally in that camp.
That's especially better if you're with people.
Yeah.
Just watch that with friends.
Yeah, I just liked it. I don't want to have to think when I watch a movie. I just want to be entertained. I don't watch very many movies because I have young kids and have other things to do. But if I do, I want to just turn off my brain and just be entertained. Or who likes the rich story? Anybody here okay, you guys you're more engaged than I am in movies. Biblical narrative or biblical story. So what are they? Well, biblical narratives are stories. Now you need to understand this. They are purposeful stories, retelling the historical events of the past that are intended to give meaning and direction for people in the present. That's really important. That's a point I'm going to make in a couple slides. But I just want to say this. The Bible retells the past and foretells the future to help us live in the present. So when the biblical authors retell the past, we looked at this in 1 Corinthians 10. They says, look at what happened to these people. Look at what happened to these people. Look at what happened to these people. What's the point? He's saying, look at all the blessings they enjoyed, like the blessings you're enjoying. And yet they were judged for their idolatry. You're enjoying blessings, yet you can be judged for your idolatry. It's a warning. He's retelling the past to instruct them how to live in the present. To say, God has worked this way in the past, He will work this way in the present. But then, why does the Bible foretell the future? Well, when we read of the assurance of our resurrection, what is that to do in our hearts? We're supposed to have hope. We're supposed to have confidence to sustain us in the present. And just note that most of the material is in the form of narrative texts in various forms of narrative. Okay. Some features of narrative. Now, narrative can refer to the type of book as a whole or to sections within a book. So, if you think about And what's a book an Old Testament book that you would say is narrative? Yeah. Exodus, predominantly narrative, yeah. It's got some legal code in there, yeah. Genesis, predominantly narrative. There are some poetic sections in there on occasion, but yeah, predominantly narrative. Ruth, again, predominantly narrative, or Esther. But then we can have books that have sections of narrative. So, Galatians. Think about Galatians. Well, as a whole, we would say Galatians is epistle, or predominantly characterized by discourse. But chapter 2 is all this autobiographical narrative. Do you remember what's chapter 2? Talks about, going and opposing him to his face. So often books of the Bible contain more than one genre. We've seen this already. Biblical narrative, like other narrative texts, contain certain elements. So here are some elements that you should expect. And again, you've had a good literature class, I'm sure, that's developed these, but they have settings. They have a certain setting for what goes on. There's a plot. There's characterization. Now, you think about something like the book of Acts. It's predominantly narrative. A lot of discourse in there, but predominantly narrative. There is characterization. Now, some characters get developed at more length. Some don't. Book of Acts really centers on two primary human characters. Who are those two primary humans? Peter and then Paul, right? There are other characters that appear, but they don't have a development in their character like Peter and Paul do, for example. The author doesn't dwell on them at the same length. And then there are conclusions, right? We expect that with a story. We expect the story to land the plane, if you will, to come to a conclusion, to come to a resolution, even if that resolution in some ways is to be continued. That's in some ways how the story of Matthew ends, right? The story of Matthew ends with Jesus' grand commissioning of His disciples, and the major events of Jesus' life have come to the climax and the cross. Then we have the concluding action and the resolution of all things. But in some ways, it's to be continued. The church is to carry out this Great Commission. Or more explicitly, in the Gospel of Luke, it is continued. How is it continued? In the book of Acts. They're the same author, I believe, to the same audience. And you know this, that biblical narrative also often includes intertextuality, references to the Old Testament. So this is something that we've come to expect. Okay, I'm going to say this again. They retell the past and foretell the future to help us live in the present. So we should not say, but we're not under the Mosaic covenant anymore, so that those stories don't matter. Those are written, Paul would say, for our instruction, so that through the encouragement and perseverance we might have hope. We shouldn't also say, and I've heard some people say that, well, text about the future, that doesn't matter, because we'll figure that out when we get there. No, those two are written to sustain us and instruct us in the present. So don't neglect either historical events in the past, narrative in the past, nor neglect narrative events in the future. I also want to make a comment about levels of biblical narratives. There can be individual stories, like in Galatians 2. There can be a story of a book as a whole. There can be a meta-narrative of the Bible as a whole. Now, let's think about this. I'm going to try to draw here. We've had mixed results with that. Let's think about the storyline, progressing storyline of the book of Samuel, for example. I told you that it's originally one book, but scroll length comes into an issue there. So if we think about the storyline of Samuel, Samuel has these arcs, right? So we start out with Eli, right? And he's not a very big story, but he kind of comes to a quick conclusion. Like, there's some good things Eli's doing, but fathers need to instruct their sons. And he does a really bad job about that. So we have Eli. He's our first character. Then we have Samuel, who figures a little more prominently. I'll call him Samuel. And then what happens, my Samuel here is getting in the way of my other Samuel, so book of Samuel. And then who's the next major character who has a rise to power and then a tragic end? Yeah. Saul, right? So Israel demands a king. It's not a good thing, but they come to Samuel and said, we need a king. And I should have made my Samuel bigger here because he exists over a longer portion here. But Saul rises to power. Things are really good. The kingdom's kind of consolidated. He goes and he leads the people in defeat of their enemies. So Saul starts doing really well, and then he has a tragic end. Right? Saul, he does some really bad things. He doesn't completely obey when God says, destroy the Amalekites. He does other wicked things like consulting the witch at Endor. He even takes it upon himself to make a sacrifice, and then there's that pervasive thing of trying to murder David. In this overlap between the rule of Samuel, we have another character introduced, right? And this character, David, comes in at the time where Saul has his downfall, and he rises to great heights, to the point where we're really excited, but he also has a downfall. So we have an intersection here in the ministry of Samuel and David, but after Saul has been rejected as king and he's on his downward slope here, we have the intersection of David coming to his ascendancy. You see how those different, you have those different arcs, right? So Eli is ministering. There's kind of like a blessing of Hannah that seems like a good thing. And then you have Samuel, but Samuel's sons, like Eli's sons, are wicked as well. And Saul, and then his tragic downfall. And then David, and we're really excited because on the ascendancy of David, when things are going really well, we have 2 Samuel 7, and we've got that Davidic king promised, that forever king. And then we've got Bathsheba, and we've got these rebellions, we've got a census, so that by the end, we realize that this is not our forever king. It's really tragic. So we have multiple narratives participating in one overarching narrative. But what is the main thrust of Samuel as a whole? If I said that Samuel as a whole is, the thrust of it is to trust in the Davidic king, does that get accomplished entirely in Samuel? So I'm saying that even this narrative back here about Hannah, where God exalts the lowly, ultimately is a theme that's played out and points to David, that God chose the lowly and exalted him. So all of those narratives, I'm suggesting, can be read in light of this whole, trust in the Davidic king. But if we understand this rightly, the text points us beyond itself, because it tells us about a forever king. And David died, so he's not our forever king. Do you understand that? How the narrative as a whole functions at multiple levels. There's a little narrative right here of Eli, and Hannah kind of participates in that as well with the intersection of Samuel. But we need to understand that narrative in light of its arc with the Samuel narrative, but in light of the whole and the pointing to the Davidic king, which then points us to the whole of the canon, with the Davidic king ultimately being Jesus Christ. Does that make sense? How levels of narratives, like biblical narratives, they function at different levels. So, are there questions on that? It makes some sense. Now you can see why the division, let's see, it would be right here of 1st and 2nd Samuel is pretty hard, right? Because you're picking up David in the middle of an arc. It really makes sense as a whole. So, okay. Let me talk about the primary actor. The primary actor of the overarching story of the Bible is God Himself. God Himself is the primary actor of the overarching story of the Bible. So even in our phrase that we learned in this class, we didn't say, people must follow God is the story of the Bible. No, we said God enacts His kingdom. It's about God acting. That's the story of the Bible. You also need to say that narratives have a narrator who selects, tells, and interprets events to be recorded. There's a narrator. And this narrator, among all of the things that he could say, chooses to say these particular things. So we saw in the narrative of the Gospel of John 20, he's like, hey, there's a lot more things that Jesus did and taught. I hope you realize that to be true. He said, but these things I have written. So I've a lot of things that I saw and I witnessed, I'm choosing these so that you might believe. Or we have Luke, who takes a similar approach. He said, look, a lot of people have written these things. Assuming here that Luke has heard from other people, he's read some of these written sources, but he says, I'm writing this orderly account. So I'm trying to craft a narrative of the events of Jesus' life. Now, that means that an author is going to order things in particular ways. So, for example, let's say Jesus had certain teachings that He repeated over the course of His lifetime. Let's say, for example, He retold a parable. Now, that's not plagiarism. It was His parable. He can do with it as He wants. But if He retells that parable, well, then the gospel author might choose to include the parable here, and another gospel author might choose to include it here. Both are perfectly accurate, but they're including it in one point versus another to make a particular point about Jesus. Narrators have a point of view. So, I remember I told you about, I don't know why this gentleman's come up so many times, but my Hindu Episcopalian Buddhist professor that I studied with at a secular school. I remember him walking us through Old Testament narratives, and then he read the description of what's going on in Solomon's court, and how it talks about like silver being so abundant, that the people were so wealthy just because of the abundance of God's blessing. And then he read a story a while later of a lesser king. And then he said, well, look, in the archaeological record of the days, there's these time periods, and of the way that other countries record prominence, it's like this guy over here, he was really wealthy. And see, the biblical authors, they're not even accurate. And I said, well, wait a second here. Like, that's not in every sense what the biblical author's point of view is. The biblical author is looking at these kings, like in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, on the basis of their faithfulness to God. Not on necessarily the amount of money that they have or the prosperity of the land. Now, that flows. God blesses those people as they're faithful to their covenant. But the primary criterion with which the author of 1st and 2nd Kings is judging the kings is not on financial wealth, but on faithfulness to the covenant. The narrator has a point of view. It's an interpretation of those events. Okay, let's divide narrative tasks into 3 basic categories. I realize that this is simplifying things that should be more complex, but I think it's helpful at least if we have categories. There are historical narratives, there are prophetic narratives, and then there are parables. Okay, so historical narratives, these are extended things. In many Old Testament books and Gospel and Acts, historical narratives, the predominant literary form. Prophetic narratives, again, are a subtype of historical narrative, but they can include extended sections of prophetic or apocalyptic material. And then parables. Now, parables are a type of narrative often embedded within a larger narrative. Right? Let's try to spend like 5 minutes on each of these ideas. Historical narratives. Okay. Their importance. They're important. You can look at those verses later. They're really important for our Christian life, and there's just some verses that are there to remind you. Old Testament narratives. I do think that bears repeating, though. That sometimes people are like, oh, I don't need to read those again. I know the basic gist of the stories. I want to say, like, no. Those stories are written for your instruction. Like, you are not Samson, in that you have not been called to judge God's people. You have not been anointed as the physical deliverer of God's people. And you do not have superhuman strength. If you do, I want to see it. So there's a difference. Like, you can't say, like, I'm like Samson, but you can be like Samson in being called to faithfulness to God. There's a message in those narratives that's for our good. So the narrator, I want to say this again, he has a purpose in telling the story. He chooses what is included, and he chooses from whose perspective it is told. All of those are choices. They're deliberate decisions that an author makes to craft the narrative in a particular way that communicates the message that he's getting at. So, I mentioned the arcs of Samuel. Well, the author is trying to communicate a particular message. Like, well, why doesn't he give us more detail about Samuel? I've got some curiosities about Samuel. Well, so do many of us. But the primary message is not about Samuel. And sometimes when we're reading these narratives, we go off on what seems like a tangent. And we're like, why are we there? I want to encourage you, the right response in that moment is to say, this must have been a dumb author who didn't know how to tell a good story, so he went off on an excursus that really doesn't matter. That is not the approach that we should have. Let's take this approach of humility and say, I don't understand what the author did here. I really want to know. And because God is the ultimate author, let me just also assume that He's a better storyteller than I am a reader of stories. So let's try to read carefully and say, what are the clues that the narrator's giving us to say why he's weaving the story in this way? How does it actually fit together as a beautiful whole, instead of just assuming that it's deficient? Does that make sense? And honestly, we've all heard people assume some deficiency in a story. And honestly, not in the Bible, but in other places, we've all read bad books, right? Has anybody just read a bad book and be like, this is not well told? Yeah. So my kids, I read a lot of books out loud to my kids. And I have a few criteria for that. It has to be a story that interests me. I'm going to spend all the time reading it. I want it to be interesting to me. If it's going to be a long one. If it's a quick one that's going to take me 10 minutes, that's fine. But a long one, it's got to interest me. I also say it's got to like have a point. Like it's got to be something that I want to impress upon my kids in some way. And it's got to be well done. So I'm not gonna read a story that's just poorly written because it will frustrate me. Thankfully, in the Bible, there aren't any poorly written stories. Scenes, there are scenes. And again, Old Testament narratives tend to have successive scenes. And there are characters, and they appear in contrast or in parallel. So we saw that when I talked about Samuel. There's multiple major characters, and some of them are contrast. So we have a contrast between Saul and then David, who's a man after God's own heart. But there's a contrast even among the minor characters, not just the major characters, but sometimes we'll see a minor character who rightly responds to God's anointed one versus one who wrongly responds to God's anointed one. And another thing is this, and this just is good literature. Characterization occurs through the character's own words and deeds, primarily. So, you don't get a list of characters at the beginning of a story with all of their stats, right? You don't get the list of, this is a right, so we're going to talk about David. Righteous man, does good things, but has some tragic flaws or something like that. That actually develops as the author tells the story. And there are plots, beginnings, middles, and end, and they tend to move quickly. Okay, that's Old Testament narrative. We've read a lot of that, and I hope part of what this does is kind of whet your appetite. You're like, I want to hear more about that. I want to know. I wish I had a whole semester where I could just dig into the Old Testament. Well, that's what Old Testament literature will do for you. So New Testament historical narratives, Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. That's a significant portion of the New Testament. You think about the four Gospels, Acts and its length, and then Revelation, that's a lot of material that is narrative. And here are just some principles. I thought this could just be helpful to hear, again, from this book, some principles. And interpret them as history. That they really happened. These events really happened. Discern why they recount the events the way they do. Now, this goes back to saying the author or the narrator is telling a story in a particular way for a particular purpose. You need to compare parallel passages, especially with the Gospels. So there's often juxtaposition. There's often, we looked at that when we looked at John, right? We were looking at John, and we encounter this man, Nicodemus, and we're like, if anybody's going to recognize the Messiah, it's going to be Nicodemus. He's a teacher of the law. He's a man of wisdom. And we leave with ambiguity. And then we encounter John the Baptist, this kind of strange character out in the wilderness. And more than anyone else, he recognizes Jesus as the Savior of the world, the coming King. So we have these two examples, and our next story is this woman at the well. So we have a learned Jew, and then we have a kind of strange Jew with John the Baptist, and then we have a Samaritan. They're juxtaposed, but what happens with the Samaritans? They follow in the path of John the Baptist and seeing Jesus as the Messiah. Pay attention to the editorial or narrator comments. We looked at this when we looked at the narrator comment tool, right? You got to Be attuned to that. If the narrator says, this is the interpretation, do you know what the interpretation is? That's it. Discern if the author intends you to imitate a character. This is important. This is what we looked at with the copycat tool. Okay, we have a lot of characters interacting in a narrative. Some of those you should not be like. Some of those you should be like. Distinguish between description and prescription. Again, that goes back to that copycat tool where we gave you some principles for seeing when a text is prescriptive versus descriptive. And then he says, understand the kingdom of God. We talked about that as well. We can see how stories in a series have a function. But we've even seen how stories over the course of a letter, or in the gospel as a whole, can have a function. So in the Gospel of John, we have a number of signs. And they begin with these small signs. He changes water into wine. He has the ability over nature in the calming of the storm. And he has the ability to restore wholeness to somebody. As a man born blind. So he can undo some of the curse of being born as a frail human. And then these climax with, he has the ability to bring Lazarus back from the grave. And the preeminent miracle is what? His own resurrection. So that if you see a series of stories within a letter as a whole, you see the climax and progression in the Gospel of John. Prophetic narratives. I'll be brief here. This is a good quote. The Bible presents Yahweh's prophets as ambassadors of the heavenly court, individuals whom God commissioned for two purposes: to preach for God to the people and to pray for God, the people to God. To preach for God to the people and to pray for the people to God. Sometimes prophets spoke in answer to questions, but most prophetic utterances were from God to call people to covenant faithfulness. That's the major function of Old Testament prophecy, calling people to covenant faithfulness. Even though sometimes they're predicting events, most of the time it's the call to be faithful. And this book by Jason Dirachi is really helpful in thinking about categories of prophetic speech as we think about prophetic narrative. This is something that you're going to develop at much more length in Old Testament. This is merely just a quick introduction here to know that it's got to be developed at more length. And our time is regrettably ticking away. Okay, I want to go to another one, parables. Because oftentimes when we read parables, there's challenges with understanding and interpretation. So parables, they're short stories, typically brief, that provide a central teaching point. Okay? Now, with parables, we have to observe a number of things to say, what is the main point? Sometimes the narrator gives us the main point. Sometimes there's the disciples come and say, but tell us, what did that parable mean? And then he gives us a detailed explanation. So the parable of the sower, for example, we get a detailed explanation. But they have typically one main teaching point. So I heard of someone who was teaching a Sunday school class and had been teaching for over 2 years on a single parable and intended to teach for another 1.5 years on that same singular parable. Now, there is a richness in God's Word, but I want to suggest that you probably are explaining things at that point that was not intended in the parable. Because the parables are supposed to be short, engaging, pithy, and pointed stories to drive typically to a singular point. Let me illustrate this. Turn in your copy of Scripture to Matthew chapter 13. I'm going to give you a couple interpretations. 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. So we have an endorsement here of shrewd business dealing. Like when you think about how this parable impacts your life, it means you should be shrewd with business deals. And sometimes that means you don't present things in the perfect way in order to get ahead. Is that the meaning of this parable? Like, no, that doesn't seem right. Well, what if I said this? Well, look, this parable, it presupposes private property. It presupposes a person's ability to buy and sell goods at his own desire. So this is an implicit endorsement of a capitalistic economic system. Yes? No? The first one was like clearly wrong, right? The second interpretation, if you're like, nah, why? Why do you're shaking your heads now, like that's not good. Yes?
It was in that culture. I mean, that's how it is today. But like, that's not...
It's just something with your textual spidey senses is off, right? It's like something's wrong there. Yeah?
Because like the Bible, especially like kind of strays away from like politics and like saying you should
Okay.
this political thing, so it wouldn't make sense for Jesus to like put in a message
About, yep.
he actively avoided that topic because you actively
Yep.
questioned him about it.
Good. What textual features point us to the meaning of this parable? Are there textual features? Yes. Oh, surrounding text. Okay. Well, how far back do I need to go? I think I told you Matthew is actually organized around a series of discourses. One of the discourses is chapter 13, Parables of the Kingdom. 13:1, the same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, great crowds gathering, so he got into a boat and sat down. The whole crowd stood on the beach and he told them many things in parables. So we have a string of parables. What are these parables making a point about? Well, we've got a parable of the sower. And part of the parable of the sower is it shows how there's a mixed response to the kingdom of God. The message of the kingdom goes out and there's a mixed response. And then what's another parable? Well, we get an explanation there. The parable of the weeds. What's that parable of the weeds? Well, the parable of the weeds explains why God doesn't judge everybody immediately. Why He allows the message to keep going out. The parable of the mustard seed and the leaven, well, that explains, like, if this is so glorious, why isn't everyone responding immediately? And it makes the message of even though there is a humble beginning to this declaration about the kingdom, it will grow and be great. There's an explanation there. Then we have more parables of the kingdom of heaven. And the parable of the hidden treasure is combining with the parable of the pearl of great price to show the immense value of the kingdom of heaven, that it's more valuable than anything else. And then there's a couple more parables. But you're right, we need to read these, observing textual clues in a string of parables to see what the author is trying to communicate to us. Okay, a couple more comments. Like, I know my time is 30 seconds away. There was a scholar who said every parable has only one meaning. That's been debated, so that most people will say if there are multiple characters, there might be multiple meanings. So, parable of the prodigal son. Well, you've got three main characters. So there's a message about the prodigal, there's a message about the father, there's a message about the older brother. But I also want to say the meaning is not exhaustible, and it also exists within the context, right? So these parables aren't islands in themselves. They're placed in a broader narrative so that part of the message of that parable is a criticism of the Pharisees. And in fact, what happens in Luke 15 is it says something to the effect the Pharisees who were greedy and loved money were indignant about what Jesus had said. Okay. Well, there's more we could say. I'll leave you with this. Here's some listing of the parables. So you'll see they occur predominantly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and there are more in Matthew than in the others.